Preston.
Good to see you.
James, how are you? Very well, thank you.
Deputy Speaker's on time.
Honourable members, the Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? And I call the member for Scullin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As you'd be well aware, for Melburnians, the past few days have been very emotional. People have been reconnecting with the things they've been so desperate to be doing, and even more importantly, with the people they love. And let me be clear, I rise here to say this: they have earned it. The people of Melbourne have been magnificent over the last 18 months, and I'm so proud to be a Melburnian, and I'm so proud of what Melburnians, and particularly the people of Scullin, have achieved. I acknowledge the great leadership of our Premier, Daniel Andrews, and Brett Sutton as well, who have been consistent in keeping people safe and communities safe and communicating effectively what they have been doing in the interests of our communities. But it's the people of Melbourne at large who I want to acknowledge here, because there have been so many voices talking us down, so many cynical and opportunistic voices talking us down and in fact putting people and communities at risk. But Melburnians have stood strong against this. Frontline workers, healthcare workers, retail workers, cleaners. A big shout out to the teachers who've done an incredible job managing learning from home. But our successes are the work of everyone. People who've sacrificed so much to stay safe and to keep all of us safe, out of care, with selflessness and compassion. And I say again, thank you to everyone. There are so many inspiring stories that I can tell, and I'm sure you can too, Deputy Speaker, and my friend, the member for Jagga as well. So many acts of generosity and of leadership, neighbours checking in on each other, the work of pop-up vaccination clinics, including ones open right now. I think about the Macedonian community, their cultural centre in High Street, making sure that everyone has the chance to stay protected. And one of the things that's been clear to me and concerning to me is the way in which this pandemic has exposed cracks and weaknesses in our society, and how it has affected some more than others in the community. These are important questions that government should be addressing right now, and an Albanese Labor government will be addressing. But there is an example that we can have regard to, and that example has been in the behaviours of the people that I'm so proud to represent in this place. People who have recognised that some people have felt the pains of restrictions more than others, that some people have been left more isolated than others. And the way in which the people of Melbourne have responded has been nothing short of inspirational. I'm so proud of everyone that I represent for all that they have done, and I really hope that everyone can stay safe and enjoy these hard-won freedoms.
Thank you, the member for Scullin, and call the member for Bonner.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to celebrate the life of the little legend that is Richie Walsh, the most inspiring boy that I have ever met. My first introduction to the Walsh family was in October of last year, when I helped them seek permanent residency here in Australia, and my electorate of Bonner so Richie could receive treatment for a rare form of cancer that he was battling. What started out as an initial request for support very quickly evolved into a special bond. Richie fought incredibly hard. He loved life and lived it to the fullest. That I will never forget. A few weeks ago, I attended Richie's celebration of life, where all guests were asked to wear the colours of the rainbow in his memory. It was a beautiful ceremony where precious family moments and cherished memories were shared by those nearest and dearest to him. Deputy Speaker, the Walsh family are truly remarkable. During this time, their enormous hearts for helping others hasn't been diminished. Everywhere Richie went, he took his headphones and his iPad. He was famous for them. Even Richie's nurse said that she'd never seen him without them. With the Bonner community, as well as many Australians across the country touched by Richie's story and legacy, the family asked that the condolences for Richie were in the form of donations so they could send iPads engraved in his name to every bed on the oncology ward at the Queensland Children's Hospital. In just under 1 week, the Walsh family smashed their fundraising target for the Queensland Children's Hospital, and 27 engraved iPads are now on their way to children on the oncology ward. But the family isn't stopping there. They are now fundraising to not only send another batch of iPads to the Children's Hospital here in Brisbane, but also to every bed on the oncology ward at Perth's Children's Hospital. And they aren't limiting themselves to Australia either, and they are planning to send iPads to the children battling cancer in Richie's hometown of Manchester in the UK. A beautiful full-circle act of generosity which will touch the lives of so many children and their families around the world. The Walsh family are currently in the process of registering Little Legends for Richie as a charity to raise funds for children battling cancer and their families. They are already a dedicated team on board to help with all of the work and planning involved with registering this charity and making sure that it honours Richie's life. I will keep sharing Richie's legacy. He can always count on me to be in his corner. Rest easy, Little Legend.
Thank the member for Bonner. Call the member for Jagajaga.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I remain very concerned about the way the NDIS is operating under this Morrison government. Under this government, the NDIS is not delivering for people with disability, their families and their carers as it should. Even while the government says it's scrapped its plan for independent assessments, and I very much hope that we can trust the government on that, we know that participants and families at the moment remain fearful about reviews, they remain fearful about decisions that they don't understand and that are inconsistent. I hear far too many stories from my constituents of long battles of people trying to have their plans reviewed or people trying to get support that is reasonable and necessary. Individuals and families come to my office and they're worn out. They're worn out from some kind of bureaucratic battle where they can't get to the bottom of why they're not getting the support that they should. Of course, I do what I can to fight for better outcomes for those people. But until we get a Labor government in place, a government that understands, that values, that backs the NDIS, we are not going to get the support that people with disability, their families and their communities deserve to live a good and decent life. Deputy Speaker, Jagajaga local Anne-Marie reached out to my office after she experienced a delay in a response from the NDIS regarding a new wheelchair that she really needed. Anne-Marie suffers from myasthenia gravis, a chronic complex autoimmune disorder in which antibodies destroy neuromuscular connections. She also has around 15 spinal compression fractures. My office asked the NDIA what was going on with her wheelchair request and the reason for the delay, and this is the response we got. The updated quote provided by Anne-Marie couldn't be considered at the time, as there was an active internal review which limits the planner from making updates to the plan. I understand Anne-Marie withdrew the internal review, but it appears the planner was not aware this had occurred. What does that even mean? This is a wheelchair that is essential for someone's life, and that's how they're being dealt with. It's a disgrace. According to Anne-Marie, the lifting mechanism on this wheelchair would help her immensely, helping her transfer from the chair to bed, to the car, to the shower, etc. And shortly after I made a representation on Anne-Marie's behalf, she was given an outcome. She was given the wheelchair as reasonable and necessary, but she was not given this lift component that would allow her to use the chair for all those purposes. It does not make sense. The NDIS under this government is not operating as it should, and this is just one example of many that have come to my office, that I know have come to many of my colleagues' offices. And we are doing all we can to fix that for these individual cases. But what we need is a system that works for all these people, a scheme that works for all these people, and a government that will back the NDIS.
Thank the member for Jagajaga and call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My mission is to help make the Sunshine Coast the place to be for education, employment and retirement. To make that a reality as we look forward from COVID-19, we need to encourage growth in new sectors like healthcare and high-tech manufacturing, and we need to ensure local young people are ready to take on the smart jobs of the future in these sectors on the Sunshine Coast. That's why recently I was pleased to deliver a grant of $524,455 from the Morrison government to the MIE Labs project, organised by dedicated University of the Sunshine Coast lecturer Natalie McMaster. The MIE Lab provides evidence based on early interventions in schools, focusing on crystallising students' burgeoning interest in science and technology. It helps our students to recognise their abilities and potentials in STEM, breaks down gender stereotypes to encourage more young women to pursue these careers, and demonstrates the relevance of STEM study to getting a great future job. The Morrison government's funding will extend the reach of the MIE Lab program from an initial pilot to engage with 5,000 more students across 50 additional schools. And it'll support the presentation of 15 STEM-focused career education workshops for parents and carers throughout the South East Queensland region. MIE Labs came about because of USC technologist Peter Embleton's vision to use day-to-day electronics to help students of all ages and abilities to understand the way of thinking that is used in STEM. Now, thanks to Natalie and Peter's hard work, this project leaves behind not only thousands of inspired students, but teachers with new skills to encourage and develop that interest right across our region. MIE Labs will complement the incredible RoboCoast program already operating in my community, led by Chancellor State College teacher, the incredibly dedicated Simon Richardson. And the RoboCoast program brings robots and robotics clubs into schools over South East Queensland, in fact, right around the country. I want to thank Simon for hosting me and MIE Labs at Chancellor to launch the new funding announcement. Simon introduced us there to some incredibly young students who, inspired by his work, are already founding technology companies in their spare time. Binara Wasala, in grade 12, for example, has been running his own design and 3D printing business, Binary Designer, for the past 2 years, working with dozens of clients from hobbyists to local food manufacturers, while Talia Harris has begun a not-for-profit, Gear Up Robotics, to go into Indigenous communities in North Queensland with robotics equipment and spread the STEM message. Congratulations, Talia and Binara, and all these young students starting their own businesses.
I thank the member for Fisher and call the member for Macarthur.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a very difficult and confusing time for all of us. There are many, many loud voices being heard around the country. One voice that we don't hear very often is the voice of young people. And I'm very pleased to read in Parliament today a speech from a young man from southwestern Sydney, 14-year-old Sabri, and his vision for our future. It's very important that we do not just pay lip service to our young people, but we listen to their voices and do what we can to make sure they fulfil their potential. Sabri is a bright and forward-thinking 14-year-old from southwestern Sydney, and I quote his speech. Australia needs to be well harnessed for our future, mainly when we are seeing enhanced technology being released every year, from phones to air conditioners. I would love to see big retailers manufacture technology in Australia. It would boost our economy and our job growth, and also we will need to embrace and create new masterpiece technologies such as artificial intelligence and biotechnology in Australian industries, and reduce emissions to maintain a globally competitive, equal quality lifestyle for our citizens. With the nation's populations expected to rise, we need to stand shoulder to shoulder and boost infrastructure and services to help create more growth and strengthen our economy. If this is looked upon, it could result in a financially well-harnessed and highly skilled, dynamical, enhanced Australian future." End quotes. That's a great speech, Sabri, and who could argue with your thoughts? It's very important, as I've said, that we listen to the voices of our young people. They have not been heard, I don't believe, during the pandemic with any sufficient force, and they are the ones whose futures we need to make sure are as prosperous and as dynamic as ours have been. Our young people need to be supported in a whole range of ways. Better technology, vocational education in schools, vocational education hubs in every high school in the country would be something that I think would be very important for our young people. Better access to high technology university courses for all concerned would be another great advantage to our young people. Listening to their voices in things like housing affordability, in things like healthcare would be, again, very important. We're not listening to our young people, and it's very important that we do listen to them and act on what they want. I'm very, very proud to be part of the Raise Our Voice in Parliament's campaign for Australia's youth, but I do think it's very important that we continue to listen to our young people and listen to what their wants and vision for the future is. Thank you.
I thank the member for Macarthur and call the member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. As of yesterday afternoon, there have been over 2 million vaccination shots administered in South Australia. That represents 79% first dose, 62.3% second dose. And while this is a significant mark, we are obviously lagging behind primarily New South Wales, ACT and Victoria. And those who choose not to get vaccinated, let me say this is where the rubber hits the road, and the reason we are not able to open the borders yet in South Australia is because those rates are not as high as the national roadmap. So I urge those that haven't got vaccinated thus far to do so. Having said that, I think we are victims of our success, if you like, and those jurisdictions that have not had the high case numbers, there is a sense of less urgency within the community. So I'm not sure that we are nailed onto a higher percentage of people who will not get vaccinated, but we certainly at this stage have a higher percentage of people who are not vaccinated. I continue to field a few calls in my office from people upset about the fact that they have restrictions and the concept of a vaccine passport, if you like. And I've been trying to make the point that when it comes to our international borders, it's the Australian government that's in control. And at this stage, we have very few coming into Australia, full stop, and the federal government has moved to come up with an electronic proof of vaccination, which may facilitate, firstly, movements into Australia, but then make life easier for people as they move around their states and their communities. But the point being, of course, that it's the states' rights, and they choose whether or not they let people over their borders or not. And I have a lot of people raise Section 92 of the Constitution, but I can assure them the Biosecurity Act actually allows states to do so and have these rights. So while they may not be happy at it, it is the state regimes they need to deal with. And states have the rights and responsibilities to protect their citizens. Similarly, businesses have the rights and responsibilities to protect their workers and their customers as well. And we're seeing now a number of large employers around Australia state that they will only have vaccinated workers on their workforce. We know that's happened with the airlines first. And now we've had Coles, I think, and Woolworths and BHP said that their workers will be vaccinated by the end of January. So while people might have a bit of a vent around it, these things aren't within the government's control. But I think they're right and proper. I applaud those companies that are actually making that stance. But not all evil originates in Canberra, I might say. So hang with us, get vaccinated, let's get us over the line and they'll get those borders open.
I thank the member for Grey and call the member for Hunter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm proud that for many years now, and more recently with the member for North Sydney, I've co-convened the Australia-Armenia parliamentary group. My relationship with the community was in part born out of the relationship, of course, the Anzacs forged with Armenian forces during the First World War, and of course my interest in the terrible events of 1915, known as the Armenian Genocide. It's been a little more than a year since Azerbaijan launched indiscriminate and unprovoked attacks against the Republic of Artsakh, formerly known as Nagorno-Karabakh. The former Soviet Union satellite remains occupied by Turkey-backed Azerbaijani forces. The Azerbaijani invasion resulted in the death of around 5,000 young Armenian men. Azerbaijani forces destroyed civilian infrastructure, including hundreds of schools and places of worship. More than 100,000 innocent civilians have been displaced. The Armenian Australia community has been in a state of overwhelming devastation, shock and despair as they've witnessed their homeland desecrated at the hands of Azerbaijani forces, including paid Turkish-backed Syrian mercenaries. The relative silence of the international community is, of course, of great concern to the Armenian diaspora. Azerbaijan's military aggression against indigenous Armenians in Artsakh involved alleged war crimes using cluster and white phosphorus munitions and attacks on Armenian churches, hospitals, civilians and schools. The world is rallying, the Armenians around the world are rallying to assist those who were displaced, to their great credit. Australian Armenians have joined diaspora around the world in calling for the international community to call out Azerbaijan and to stop their belligerent activities. Australia should do just that. A number of countries, including France, the USA and bodies such as the European Parliament, have rightly publicly condemned Azerbaijan's deliberate violations of international law. We should join with the many across the globe by making our unhappiness about the situation in Artsakh well known and by recognising the right of self-determination for the people of Artsakh. The conflict is a test for the robustness of our international architecture and the rules-based order we all rely so much upon. We must pass the test, Mr Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Hunter and call the very eager member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And after a couple of false starts, I look forward to first and foremost acknowledging the dedicated work of Dr Charles du Plessis, who practices medicine in some of the most remote northern goldfields towns and Aboriginal communities in my electorate of O'Connor. Dr du Plessis is a much-loved doctor whose skill and professionalism has been acknowledged by his peers in awarding of the prestigious Royal Australian College of General Practitioners 2021 WA GP of the Year. Dr du Plessis has resided and worked in some of O'Connor's most harsh and challenging climatic and social environments for the last 10 years. While his family currently live in Perth, he is a regular feature at the Leonora and Laverton Hospital GP clinics and conducts outreach clinics to Aboriginal communities like Cosmo Newsbury. Dr du Plessis' dedication to his patients came to the fore during COVID, when he chose to remain locked down with his communities when they were sealed off from the rest of WA as a dedicated biosecurity zone. While many services deserted these remote communities, Dr du Plessis knew he would be required to support the many chronic and complex health and emotional needs of his patients at a time of such great uncertainty. Dr du Plessis also plays an important role in supporting the frontline health and emergency service providers who are working under great pressure in these communities. So I take this opportunity not only to congratulate Dr du Plessis on his well-deserved award, but to also send a big shout out to the health and emergency service workers in the Northern Goldfields. People like Ken Hart, the sole St John's community paramedic for the Northern Goldfields. Ken is on call 24/7, dealing with the victims of family and domestic violence, alcohol-related harm, self-harms, car accidents and major medical emergencies. Ken often requires the backup from local police officers like Leonora Station Sergeant Jamie Cresswell and Officer Tom Clendenning. This dedicated team works under constant pressure. Together, they support the wonderful Royal Flying Doctor Service, who are regularly called out to the Northern Goldfields, sometimes carrying out multiple medical evacuations in a day. And on the ground and embedded in her community is Naomi Sprigg dos Santos, who has child safety as her #1 priority in her role with the WA Community Health Service. Pharmacist John Kufos is the only pharmacist for hundreds of kilometres, filling prescriptions and giving sound advice on complex health conditions, but also supporting childcare and dietary needs. Hope Community Service counsellors Sam Doran
and Norma Ashwin also helped support the myriad of mental health needs of the Northern Goldfields, including those affected by FASD, chronic alcoholism and drug use, sex abuse and domestic and family violence. And finally, to all the nurses, carers and especially those that volunteer, thank you from the bottom of my heart. You all deserve an award, just like Dr du Plessis, in recognition of the selfless and tireless work you all do keeping our Northern Goldfields communities as safe, healthy and as livable as possible.
I thank the member for O'Connor and call the member for Cunningham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, today across New South Wales, children and young people are returning to school, and it's been just a delight as you look through your Facebook feed to see all the photos up of the smiling, happy, joyful faces, as well as the children who are smiling, happy and joyful, not just the parents. It's been a really nice start to the day, and I want to extend my very best wishes to all of those students. We do understand, of course, that academic engagement at school is so important, but so is the social side of young people's development, being with their friends, with their teachers, and I'm sure they're all very much looking forward to it today. I do want to acknowledge there are a couple of schools across my region who won't be going back today because they're closed for a deep cleanse after being the site of a close contact, and of course that will continue to be a challenge for our schools, and I'm very much of the view, and I know the Teachers Union have expressed this, that we need to make sure we're doing all that we can to ensure the schools are safe places. So in that vein, I want to extend a huge thank you to all of the parents who have put in so much effort into homeschooling over these last couple of months. And particularly, I acknowledge for many parents, they were working at home as well as doing homeschooling. And so it was a really tough ask on them. And it's clear that, parents have just stepped up. They've done that with the absolute support and backing of school teachers and support staff. Done an extraordinary job going to online learning, engaging the students and keeping contact with them. It's just, a really an extraordinary accomplishment by each and every one of them, and I want to extend my great thanks to all of them for that work. I want to also acknowledge that schools did continue to operate to provide an opportunity for the children of essential workers to be at school when their parents had to be on the front line. That, of course, happened in childcare as well, and I want to acknowledge all the teachers and educators and support staff in our childcare system who were doing the same thing over recent months. Education is such a critically important part of a child's life, a young person's life, and of course over coming weeks we've got our HSC students who are going into their final exams after all of those years of schooling. Been a really tough year for them, as it was for the group last year who did their HSC. A great campaign is running saying you've got this. We have great confidence in you, and we look forward to you giving an amazing contribution to our community into the future. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Cunningham. Call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak about a new program that really will help those experiencing domestic violence in our community. We know that the statistics are far too high, that the experience is all far too common, and certainly I know all of us around Australia are saying no to domestic and family violence, and certainly the Morrison government is absolutely committed to ending domestic, family and sexual violence. We know we know a lot about physical abuse in relationships. We are learning more and more about the emotional abuse, about gaslighting, about coercive control, about the many ways that women and men who are experiencing this sort of abuse are made to feel worthless, less than a sense of self, and an inability to control even their most basic of circumstances, safety in the home. And that's why something like economic abuse, which might involve interfering with work or controlling or withholding money, really reduces a woman's ability to leave a violent or an abusive relationship. And that's why the Morrison government has established the Escaping Violence Payment. From July 2020 to June 2021, there were almost 1,500 reported incidents of domestic violence on the Central Coast, I do want to emphasise these are reported, not a total of the unreported incidents, which means that per 100,000 people on the Central Coast, around 415 people have experienced domestic violence in this last year. The Escaping Violence payment will mean that anyone in our region leaving a violent or abusive relationship will have access, and a violent relationship will have access to a one-off amount of up to $5,000 to help them live a life free of violence. When a woman is fleeing violence, we know that the size of the house that she's fleeing doesn't matter. Often she will bundle the kids in the car, maybe the family pet, and often leave with not a lot more than the clothes on their back. Under a 2-year trial of this payment, applicants will receive financial assistance of up to $1,500 in cash, with the remainder available for goods and services or direct payments of bonds, school fees or other support to help establish a safe home. It's important to note that this new payment is not means-tested in a traditional sense, because we know that women from every walk of life can experience violence, and we want to encourage them all to reach out for support. The payment isn't taxable, it's not reportable income, and it won't impact on any other social security payments that someone may be receiving. And importantly, the payment is available right now. Uniting Care Australia Consortium has been selected as a service provider to deliver the payments, and they'll also support women to engage with other relevant services that support those fleeing violence and their violent relationships and their children. We know that ending domestic and family violence will take more than speaking about it in this place and in these corridors. We need to shift the attitude and culture in this nation, and this is certainly a good step forward.
I thank the member for Robertson. In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded. The clerk.
Private members' business, notice number 1, motion on timber shortage.
The member for Ede Monero.
I move the motion relating to timber shortage in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper.
The member for Ede Monero.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I move the motion relating to timber shortages because it is time the Prime Minister took responsibility for the severe timber shortage that is being felt right across Australia. In my electorate alone, we are seeing home construction delays of up to 18 months. And this is an area that was devastated by bushfires. That could mean an extra 18 months of people being without a home. More broadly, the timber shortage is threatening Australia's construction industry and the jobs it supports across the country. I'm standing here today raising this issue because the timber shortage and the lack of government action will disproportionately affect businesses, individuals and families in my region. We know there are several factors which have contributed to the shortage we're seeing today, including the Black Summer bushfires that devastated my region and wiped out 40% of the softwood plantation supply in parts of my electorate. The fire impacts have had a serious adverse impact on the future availability of timber products for at least the next 20 to 30 years in the southwest slopes, but also Bombala. The plantation sector is the most significant socio-economic contributor to the southwest slopes region. Thousands of jobs are reliant on this sector through Hine Timber in Tumbarumba, AKD Softwoods and Visy in Tumut. It's estimated over 500 jobs in Bombala through the Donwa Timber Mill and its surrounds. Timber processors in Tumut and Tumbarumba fear the timber shortage will lead to people losing their jobs, which would have a devastating impact on these towns. With salvage logging ending, there are fears there won't be enough wood for all the processors in the region to have continued supply at their usual levels. And I've spoken to truss and frame business owners across the region, from Bega to Tumut, who also have serious concerns about accessing supply. I've met with Hine Timber multiple times. They produce about 20% of the wood which goes to housing trusses manufactured in Australia. They, like other industries, are working hard to secure supply from alternate sources, but this means crippling increases to the cost of manufacturing due to the increased freight costs. The bushfire recovery package for processors from this government specifically excluded freight support. While Hine has found ways to continue in the short term, there is uncertainty about the long-term viability of some of these mills. Without a consistent supply of logs, mills will be forced to close and jobs will be lost. While the bushfires had a significant impact, they were not the only problem. Prior to bushfires, demand in Australia for softwood for house framing was already exceeding local supply. Timber is already being imported from overseas to frame up a fifth of our homes today. But if this shortage isn't addressed, if this shortage isn't addressed, we are headed towards a deficit of 250 house frames by 2035. A lack of action risks the timber shortage becoming an entrenched problem, where we no longer have the capacity to provide Australian softwood to build Australian homes into the future. A real plan followed by real action is needed. This government needs to listen to industry, listen to construction workers and listen to everyday Australians trying to build or renovate their homes, because this timber shortage is affecting everyone. And if the government doesn't actually do something, then we risk not having adequate supplies of Australian timber, not just next year, but over the coming decades. And the frustrating thing is this government has been well aware of this. In 2018, the Morrison-Joyce government promised to radically expand Australia's timber plantation by 1 billion trees. Today, less than 1% of that goal has been planted. If we continue at this rate, instead of hitting that target at 2050, it will take over 300 years. The concessional loan program that was set up to help meet the $1 billion trees target is yet to even open, after the government promised $500 million before the last election. The government has freely admitted the goal that was set is a long way off. But as usual, the government has offered no answers to explain this policy failure or shared any plans to fix the problem. As a nation, we cannot afford any reduction of current plantations, and this government needs to prioritise building a stronger, more competitive and ecologically sustainable forestry industry. We need to keep timber processing onshore, and we need to ensure that there is adequate local supply. We know new trees means new jobs, particularly in rural and regional areas. But right now, the promise of 1 billion trees is just another one of the Prime Minister's promises. This government has talked a big game on housing constructions, but its failures on timber shortage show it doesn't care enough. It's time for this government to deliver on its promises, or the timber shortages will grow more dire in decades to come.
The member for Eden-Monaro. Is the motion seconded? The member for Macquarie.
The motion seconded, and I reserve my right to speak.
I thank the member for Macquarie. The question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I begin by thanking the member for Eden-Monaro for giving an old carpenter and joiner like me a chance to speak about one of my favourite subjects here in Parliament. Like the most famous scene from Forrest Gump when Forrest receives a lesson from his new army buddy Bubba about the many different ways shrimp can be cooked and eaten, I could take a lot more than 5 minutes telling the chamber all about timber, how it's grown, the different species, how it's used, but out of consideration for members present, I will restrain myself. I will, though, Mr Deputy Speaker, not have any suggestion that we talk about wood, because we all know you put wood in a fire and you build things with timber. To understand the shortage that the member for Eden-Monaro refers to, we need to look at why it has come about. This shortage of timber is by no means a sign of the government's failure. It is a sign of the spectacular success, in fact, of the government's hard work and creativity in keeping the construction industry in this country afloat. After COVID-19 struck last year, established builders that I've known for decades in my community were phoning me to tell me that after August, they simply had no work. Construction on the Sunshine Coast, generating some $6.1 billion a year in our region and employing 19,000 locals, was on the brink of grinding to a halt. Within just a few months, the situation was very different, thanks to the Morrison government. I worked closely with the Assistant Treasurer on informing the creation of the government's Home Builder program. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Those same builders who'd been facing an economic cliff were almost overnight inundated with more inquiries than they'd ever seen before. Nationwide, the 2020-21 financial year produced a record level of 137,170 detached housing starts, an increase of 34.2% on the previous year. Yet Home Builder is just one of the Morrison government's many measures to encourage more domestic construction in this country. In the most recent federal budget, the government allocated $124.7 million to support the construction of more public housing stock. We've introduced the first home loan deposit scheme, the first home super saver scheme, the family home guarantee and the new home guarantee, which have stimulated huge new demand and seen first homeowners numbers at their highest in 15 years. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Morrison government unashamedly is all about first home ownership. It is about home ownership. In short, this government's measures are supporting $30 billion worth of construction work across this country. They are saving thousands of jobs in my community and has been life-changing for a wide range of Sunshine Coast locals and their businesses. This incredible success has, though, certainly contributed to a challenge of supply for building materials. The member for Eden Monaro is right on one thing when she notes that Master Builders Australia is concerned about a deficit of up to 250,000 house frames over the next 15 years. However, the member for Eden Monaro ignores another important fact, also mentioned by Master Builders. In 2021, Australia's timber mills massively increased production to meet demand, producing a record 3 million cubic metres of timber. Yet despite this record increase in domestic production, we continue to see shortages. This is not, as the member for Eden Monaro suggests, a problem of domestic supply. It is a short-term problem of global shortages and disruption to the global supply chain. Sweden is seeing its lowest stock of structural timber in 20 years. Sawmills in many parts of the world are under pressure from rising energy costs, while North American supplies are currently impacted by insect damage and recent forest fires. As we all know, container ship capacity is stretched, while road haulage in Europe is suffering from a lack of qualified drivers. At the same time, as economies open up around the world, a backlog of paused construction projects from China to the United States are beginning to ramp up again. Deputy Speaker, demand is rising worldwide at an unprecedented rate. Worldwide production is stalled. In Australia, we've stepped up and produced more timber than we have ever done before.
I thank the member for Fisher. The question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Dean.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I rise to support the motion moved by the member for Eden Monaro and to commend her for moving this important business. The member for Eden Monaro has, since she's come to this place last year, been a strong advocate for a modern forestry industry and for the communities that in turn are supported by a strong forestry industry, rightly arguing that it should have been included as part of the National Manufacturing Strategy. We know that it has a critical role to play in relation to housing affordability, with timber shortages having a flow-on effect to the cost of housing around the nation. And we also know that sustainable forestry practices can play a significant role in climate change mitigation and adaptation, Deputy Speaker. Australia's forest industries directly employ 80,000 people and contribute more than $24 billion to the economy every year. Across our region, the industry has gone through significant challenges, with the region's softwood timber industry hit hard by the Black Summer bushfires, with about 40% of the softwood plantations burned. And then, Deputy Speaker, of course, COVID. Nonetheless, despite these challenges, the industry has proven itself in response to bushfires and COVID-19 and found ways to continue operations despite lockdowns and disruptions to timber supply. But as the resolution notes, Australia has a severe timber shortage. A report by the NBA and the Australian Forest Products Association concludes Australia is heading towards a deficit of 250,000 house frames by 2035. The Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment states numerous studies show the need for 400,000 hectares of new plantations over the next decade to meet Australia's demand for timber. To put this in perspective, Australia is facing a timber production shortfall equivalent to the combined land size of Geelong and Newcastle, because we don't have the trees growing in the ground right now to meet that demand. Our timber mills have massively increased production to meet demand during the COVID-induced building boom, as noted by the previous speaker, but across the country we're experiencing severe timber shortages as demand soars and timber imports dry up. Now that some COVID restrictions have eased, you can check for yourself by comparing the current prices in Bunnings with this time last year. Australia's 2 million hectare plantation estate has been declining over the last decade, and it's critical to turn it around. An increase of 400,000 hectares in forestry hub regions will be a tiny fraction of the land devoted to agriculture in Australia. Yet this increase won't only create certainty in the supply for new homes and buildings, but it will create jobs and increase supply of a sustainable building material, a material that stores carbon and fights climate change. Now, Deputy Speaker, the government first promised to expand Australia's timber plantations by 1 billion trees in 2018. 2018 was a great year for this government to make promises. Yet answers to questions in the Senate reveal the concessional loan program set up to help meet the 1 billion trees target is yet to even open, despite the government promising $500 million before the last election. Just as there have been 1,000 days since the government announced they would establish a National Anti-Corruption Commission, 1,000 days have passed on another promise that this government has failed to deliver on. This is a government that plays the shell and pea game without the pea. It's all sizzle and no sausage. Wait for them to attempt to sell the same set of words without follow-up over coming weeks and months. And at the same time, watch them try and blame other parties and jurisdictions for the litany of promises they haven't been able to keep. And the opportunity to implement a national strategy has clearly been there with the National Cabinet. To make up for lost opportunities the last few years, what is now needed is a national level strategy to grow our timber plantation estate, including joint commitments to establish new tree plantings in key strategic timber processing regions to achieve that 1 billion trees goal. We need policy initiatives to expand plantations and farm forestry to develop sovereign capability. We need to invest in the next generation of forestry workers. And we need to recognise the role of sustainable forestry in climate change mitigation. The IPCC has noted that the sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fibre or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. Sustainable forest industries are part of the solution, not the problem. And Deputy Speaker, we need an Albanese Labor government. I again commend the motion to the chamber.
I thank the member for being questioned. Is the motion be agreed to? And I call the member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, when I arrived in this place in 2013, there was barely a mention of forest policy. There certainly was very limited discussion. There was a lot of chatter around agriculture, and rightly so. But I grew up in a timber town, and so the fact that forestry was achieving or receiving almost no attention was something that I took really seriously. And I'm pleased to say, as co-chair of Parliamentary Friends of Forestry with my good friend, the member for Hunter, we set about changing the debate in two ways. One, raising the saliency of the forest industry, that is, talking about the importance of the forest industry, which I should say HomeBuilder has turbocharged in recent months because of, obviously, issues around availability of structural timber. But the second thing we did, and probably the most powerful thing we did, particularly from the industry's perspective, is we committed to a bipartisan approach on forestry. We committed to taking that uber-politicisation around forestry out of the conversation so that we could set forestry on a pathway, irrespective of who was in government. Now, I hope by this motion that we're not charting another course, because uncertainty for this industry is death. It takes around 30 years to grow a softwood tree to the point at which it can be harvested. Any uncertainty with government policy in that time is critical, and we need to avoid that. And I've got to say, every year or so, at Parliamentary Friends of Forestry meetings, as a symbol of that bipartisan effort, the member for Hunter and I hug. And we do that to show that we are one in this place on forestry. And I am disappointed to see that there's been a breakout now of the old way. The old way. But if we're going to go back to the old way, let me point out something for those opposite that they need to address. Now, I say this against the background where I'm not seeking to politicise forestry. I want to take a bipartisan approach. But the best thing they could do, on forestry right now is to get on the phone to their Labor Party friends in Victoria and in Western Australia who are effectively ending hardwood production in this country. In the case of Victoria, they've been quite, well, relatively sensible. They've said by 2030 the Victorian native forestry industry will be gone. So if you're working in native forestry in Victoria, it's gone by 2030. Now, I said relatively sensible because, of course, in Western Australia, they've announced that it's gone by 2024. So if you're working in native forestry in Victoria, in Western Australia, your job gone in 2024. And those opposite have the temerity to come into this place and say, oh, there's a national wood fibre shortage in this country. So there is. But that's why we shouldn't be pursuing these kind of policies. And speaking about the kind of policies we should be pursuing, it's all about R&D. So, Mr Speaker, we've spoken a lot about net zero in the past fortnight. Our forest industry has the opportunity to play a key role to meet this target. In an increasingly carbon-constrained future, the forest and forest products industry is one of the few well-established carbon-positive industries, and it sits poised to benefit. Yes, the current timber supply constraints have shone a light on the need to get more trees in the ground, but let's not forget an important parallel need. For the Australian forest and forest products industry to realise its potential as an innovative, internationally competitive industry that contributes significantly to economic growth, social wellbeing, environmental sustainability, we need to increase focus on R&D. The industry faces many new opportunities for carbon sequestration, biomass, as well as expansion of wood products to meet demand driven by population growth. National coordinated research and development will increase our sovereign capability and bolster our national modern manufacturing initiatives. In 2016, the federal government initiated a pathway for increased research and development in the sector by the announcement of the National Institute for Forest Products Innovation, or NIFPI as it's known, in partnership with the states and industry. I commend the government on this initiative. A hub-and-spoke model sees national coordination and guidance through the Australia-wide NIFPI, together with continued, indeed increased funding for those NIFPIs. I'm very proud to say the very first NIFPI was established in Mount Gambier, and I, for one, know that the solution to these shortages are greater R&D in NIFPIs across the country, including mine in Mount Gambier.
Thank you, Member for Barker. The question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And sure, Labor supports bipartisanship when there's a plan. Labor supports bipartisanship when there's action. But Labor doesn't support bipartisanship to do nothing, which is what we've seen from this government. Great talks of building, great talks of planting. In fact, the government promised that they'd plant 1 billion trees of timber plantation. That was what was announced in 2018. But how many trees have been planted? That's my question to the government. Since they've been in government for 8 years, since this announcement back in 2018, remember we're 2021, so since the announcement, how many trees of that 1 billion trees have been planted? And we're talking about plantation timber. That's what Australians support. That's what the industry wants, plantation timber. How many trees have literally been planted to help us with the building construction boom that is going on? Bipartisanship is possible when you actually do something, but you cannot demand Labor sign up to bipartisanship when you do nothing, which is what we have seen from this government, particularly when it comes to the timber shortage. And what's frustrating is the industry has been warning about it for the good part of a decade, and this government have been here for 8 years now and have failed to meet the demands of the industry. In my part of the world, in the Bendigo electorate, Woodend in the south, which will come into McEwen at the next election, is still a timber town. It still is home to timber plantation. And they have been supplying into the Australian industry for many years. But like all parts of the urban growth corridor, are constantly under pressure. Will this area be the next area to be developed? I note one of the earliest speakers from the government side is from the area of the Sunshine Coast. Today, when you drive from Maroochydore to Brisbane, more and more of that land, which used to be plantation timber, is being developed for housing. And whilst we welcome development, where are these new trees being planted to just keep our supply sustainable going forward? This is a crop, this is a product that takes time to grow. It's basic math. If you don't plant the trees now, or 5 years ago when you first said that you would, we will run into a shortage. And now the government, because of their short-sighted politics, has created of their own doing the crisis we're experiencing today. They ignored the calls years ago to put the trees into the ground. Then they've introduced policies to speed up construction, which has created the bottleneck that we are experiencing now in the industry and the exorbitant prices that people are now paying. COVID and the pandemic was already going to see an explosion in demand for building products, and that's what we're experiencing. Globally, as it's already been highlighted, there is a shortage of timber. As people have moved towards this sustainable material, there are policies that have been put in place by governments and by local authorities all over the world preferring timber as opposed to other carbon-based building products that we have seen, for example, in California and that we have seen throughout Europe. So we knew that there would be a supply shortage coming, exacerbated by COVID as more and more Australians stayed home, looked to renovate their homes and looked to build. Then the government introduced the Home Builder Program, which also sped up supply and also put greater demands. The industry is now saying there's delays of 6 to 12 months. Prices have gone through the roof. They, through their short, narrow-sightedness, have not predicted, have not invested, have not ensured that to deliver the Home Builder Program, we would have the building supplies. It is crazy that the government is still stalling on this area, which is why I really welcome the motion that's been put forward by the member for Eden-Monaro. Whether you're a builder in a regional town like Bendigo, whether you're a supplier like Humanizer in my part of the world, or in many other hardware stores around Australia, you know this issue is real. Whether you're a renovator, whether you're somebody trying to get the work done yourself, we are in a timber shortage and the government needs action. It needs national leadership to make sure that this timber shortage isn't prolonged over the next few decades. We've got to get the trees into the ground. We've got to get the policy right to do so. In answers to Senate estimates, the government have revealed they're nowhere near on track to meet their own goals that they set.
I thank the member for Bendigo. The question is the motion be agreed to and call the member for O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for Eden-Monaro for bringing this motion forward, because it gives me, as a West Australian that represents timber communities, to discuss some of the WA Labor government's policies relating to timber. But I'll come back to that. I firstly want to address the motion as brought forward by the member for Eden-Monaro. And yes, Australia is experiencing a shortage of demand for timber products at the moment, and in some respects we're a victim of our own success, and certainly the Home Builder Program has turbocharged the construction industry. And as other speakers prior to me have mentioned, July, August last year, the construction industry in Australia were facing a cliff. They were applications for homes had dropped off that cliff, and they were looking down the barrel of some seriously hard economic conditions to deal with. And of course the construction industry across this nation employs over 1 million people, and the government took swift and decisive action. And I want to commend the Assistant Treasurer, Michael Sukkar, on his policy initiative in this space, and certainly across my electorate in some of the smaller regional towns we've seen an explosion in housing approvals, and certainly blocks of land that have been sitting idle for up to 10 years with no offer have all been snapped up, and it has really turbocharged the regional economy. But let's get the facts straight here. This timber shortage is a worldwide phenomenon at the moment. A particular beetle in Eastern Europe devastated the plantation estates in Europe. Much more of the product is ending up in wood pellets to power electricity generation plants across Europe. So we are seeing high demand at a time when production is dropping off. So, and as previous speakers have mentioned, this is a 30-year investment. A forestry plantation does take 30 years, so we can look back 30 years to see what the policy settings were then, and it's interesting to note that there was a Labor government in power at that point in time. But let's not look in the past, let's look to the future. And as my colleague, the member for Barker, pointed out, the federal government is investing an enormous amount of money in the forestry industry going forward. And we've committed almost $20 million to establish 11 regional forestry hubs around the country, and one of those hubs is partially situated in my electorate, and it's already giving confidence and kicking goals in terms of the forestry industry investment in that part of the world. Delivered almost $80 million in funding recovery for resilience activities following the bushfires, and I'm sure much of that $80 million ended up in the member for Eden-Monaro's electorate. It's also delivered $6 million in funding for new and existing National Institute for Forest Products Innovation Centres, at this stage situated in Gippsland, in Mount Gambier and Launceston. And these centres are delivering targeted regional research and development activities. And we know, Deputy Speaker, that's the key to developing this forestry industry. But in the time that I have left, I just want to come to the West Australian situation, and it's quite alarming what's happened in WA to our native forest industry. Now, as we know, such a long-term investment as forestry needs confidence. It needs confidence that government are going to back them, and it needs confidence that government is going to keep to their word. Now, the impact across Western Australia, and much of this in my electorate of O'Connor, the native forestry sector directly employs over 500 people and contributes $220 million to the WA economy each year. In addition to those directly employed people, it underpins many small businesses across towns like Nannup, Manjimup, Bridgetown, and many more across my electorate. And 90% of the jobs that I quoted are based in those regional communities. Now, how did this come about? How did we arrive at this situation? So the state government and the minister responsible, Minister for Forestry Dave Kelly, in 2020 made the statement in relation to Parkside, which invested $50 million in processing facilities. Parkside has come to Western Australia and made significant investments because it had the confidence that this government supports the ongoing native forestry industry. To say that we're undermining that confidence is simply not true. And what did Minister Dave Kelly announce on the 9th of September 2021? That they were pulling the rug out from under the native logging industry and closing it down in 2024. It's an absolute disgrace.
The member's time has expired. The question is that the motion be agreed to. I give the floor to the member for Green Democrat.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Roof truss suppliers across my region are declaring Australia's severe timber shortage a national crisis that is having significant knock-on effects not only for the building industry but for jobs and the economy. And it's not going to end any time soon, Deputy Speaker, according to one of the nation's leading prefab manufacturers, Timber Truss, based in my region in Geelong. Business manager Stephen Collier said the shortage will have long-lasting implications for the cost of housing and jobs in the industry. Steve says timber from overseas is costing between 85% to 125% more, and this is inevitably being passed on to the client and leading to a concerning increase in the cost of housing. And the flow-on impacts for apprentices, local carpenters, electricians, roofers and plumbers and the related retail sector are being badly felt. It's crushing for builders, Tim said. I feel particularly for the smaller construction firms and family building businesses who can't even get a quote for a job. Ultimately, this means building jobs are being pushed back by about 3 months on average. So what is the Morrison-Joyce government doing about this? Very little, it appears. Not only has the Morrison-Joyce government failed to anticipate and develop a plan to manage the nation's timber shortage, it has contributed to the crisis. The government's lack of a substantive policy, combined with failure to act on its own tree planting targets, have once again shown that it's incapable of real vision, planning and implementation. And it's not like the government wasn't warned of this crisis. Back in late June, CFMEU National Secretary Michael O'Connor wrote to Housing Minister Michael Sukkar, then Industry Minister Christian Porter and Assistant Minister for Industry Jonathan Duniam, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss support for the forestry sector. And now, more than 6 months into the crisis, there's still no coherent plan from the Morrison-Joyce government. Victoria's Master Builders Association CEO, Rebecca Casson, said builders are being so badly squeezed it's sending some broke. It's law that builders who have entered contracts must absorb the cost of delays, such as for timber shortages. It's true Australia is caught up in a worldwide shortage of timber. The US is paying up to 400% higher than normal for timber, and the devastating 2019 to 20 black summer bushfires have also contributed to the current shortage. However, Australia might not have been in such a dire position had the government had its eye on the ball. In normal circumstances, only about 20% of Australia's construction timber is imported. So this crisis is more about domestic management than international supply issues. More homes than ever are being built around this nation. Some figures suggest 20% more houses in 2021 than any previous year. The current building surge has been spurred on by various factors, some very much within the government's direct control. The government's own home builder program, for instance, which has seen 135,000 applications. The program is placing additional pressure on limited supplies and driving up prices. However, fixing the building timber supply issues need a longer-term solution. A recent joint report from Master Builders Australia and the Australian Forest Products Association says Australia's timber shortage will escalate. By 2035, the nation will be short 250,000 house frames. That's the equivalent of the housing stock in the cities of Greater Geelong and Newcastle combined. An urgent national plan is needed to address the timber shortage, but what the Morrison government has provided so far is a policy vacuum. In the short term, to alleviate the current problem, there must be support for sawmills. In the longer term, we must ensure there is a timber plantation stock to meet future housing demand. Currently, there is only 2,750 hectares of new plantations for softwood nationally, yet we need 400,000 new hectares of plantations by 2030 just to meet future demand. The Morrison-Joyce government promised to meet a $1 billion plantation trees target in 2018, but as usual, Mr Morrison has failed to do anything. Importantly, we must not let the government's failure be used to justify increased logging of our national native forests. Deputy Speaker, the construction industry is the key to economic growth. Construction in my region of high growth is so important. The Morrison-Joyce government has failed the timber industry. It's failed the construction industry. They've failed local builders and apprentices and the housing consumers. They must continue to. They must do better. Thank you.
The time allotted for the debate has expired. The debate is adjourned, and the resumption of the debate will be made an order of the day for the next sitting. The Clerk.
Private members' business. Notice number 2. Motion on Australian Security Intelligence Organisation.
The member for Barrera.
Deputy Speaker, I move the motion relating to the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation in the terms in which it appears in the notice paper.
The member for Barrera.
Deputy Speaker, many Australians don't appreciate what ASIO does to protect our freedom and our democracy by keeping terrorism, foreign interference and espionage at bay. That's because much of its important work rightly is invisible to the community. ASIO protects Australians from religiously motivated and ideologically motivated violence. They do this by collecting intelligence, analysing and investigating terrorism threats and providing advice to and working with partners to strengthen public safety and intervening to disrupt attacks. Right now, ASIO is aware of multiple threats to Australia and several extremists who want to harm Australians. Australia's terrorism threat level remains at probable. The changing nature of terrorism and violent extremism presents challenges for the early identification and detection of threats by ASIO. The threat of religiously motivated extremism from Sunni violent extremist groups persists, with the violent narrative espoused by terrorist groups such as ISIL and al-Qaeda continuing to inspire attacks here and overseas. However, people motivated by other forms of violent extremism, including ideologically motivated extremism, and specifically nationalist or racist violent extremism, are also increasingly present in Australia. This now accounts for around 50% of ASIO's current terrorism caseload. Investigations into ideological extremists have occurred in all Australian states and territories. The Director-General of Security, Mike Burgess, has said that this unprecedented shift in the national security threat to ideologically motivated extremism is being fuelled by disinformation surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic and other global events. He said, in suburbs around Australia, small cells regularly meet to salute Nazi flags, inspect weapons, train in combat and share their hateful ideology. For me, one of the most concerning aspects of their investigations is the growing number of young people, particularly young men, who are being radicalised by these ideologies. ASIO has identified people under the age of 18 involved in violent extremism and warned that minors had not only conducted terrorist attacks but held leadership positions in terrorist organisations. Violent extremist narratives particularly appeal to teenagers and may resonate with some minors' feelings of alienation, unease about the future and mistrust of adults, ASIO said in its annual report released last week. This should be a concern to all of us. In his 2021 annual threat assessment report, the Director-General of Security said, "The extremists are security conscious and adapt their security posture to avoid attention. In their online forums and chat rooms, they show they're savvy when it comes to operating at the limits of what is legal and discuss ways to beat the system in what they say and do. ASIO anticipates that the threat from this form of extremism will not diminish anytime soon and may well grow," he said. Any terrorism attack on home soil is more likely to be committed by a lone actor or a small group using simple methods and basic weapons such as knives, guns and vehicles. The threat of espionage and foreign interference is at the highest it has ever been, higher even than during the Cold War. Espionage and foreign interference involves foreign actors, including state actors, trying to steal our secrets and interfere with and ultimately undermine our democracy. ASIO has responded to these threats with targeted investigations and campaigns that have meaningfully reduced harm. Working with their partners, their activities led to law enforcement outcomes and intelligence-led disruptions. Visas have been cancelled and spy networks dismantled. These activities have led to significant reductions in the number of foreign spies and their proxies operating here in Australia. But ASIO remains concerned about the potential for Australia's adversaries to pre-position malicious code in critical infrastructure, particularly in areas such as telecommunications and energy. In this year's budget, the government is giving ASIO unprecedented capacity to do what is required to protect our people and our national interest, $1.3 billion over 10 years. The additional investment will help ASIO to continue to out-imagine and out-manoeuvre sophisticated foreign adversaries and detect and disrupt violent extremists. It will significantly enhance ASIO's ability to identify and respond to threats posed by more sophisticated groups, whether driven by religious or ideological motivations or foreign interference. ASIO needs to keep up with technological developments and stay ahead of our adversaries. 97% of priority counter-terrorism investigations are being slowed down by ASIO's difficulty in accessing encrypted messaging. This is a serious challenge, especially when the Director-General reminds us that more data was created in the last 2 years than in the rest of the entire human history. ASIO continues to adapt their counter-terrorism efforts to respond to the changing security environment. As a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, I want to say I think I speak for all members of the committee when I say we universally appreciate the candour, professionalism and independence of Mike Burgess, the Director-General of Security, and I'd like to thank all of the officers of ASIO for all that they do to keep Australia and Australians safe.
Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion and reserve my right to speak.
Thank the member. So the question before the chair is that the motion be agreed to, and I give the call to member for Jellybrand.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Barara for moving this important motion. I'm pleased to rise to support it because the men and women of ASIO, indeed across all of our intelligence and security services, do incredibly important work to keep us safe and to secure the things that we value as a nation. As ASIO's 2021 annual report, recently tabled in Parliament, highlights, the threat environment that we're dealing with is quite complex, challenging and changing. And it's one of those threats in particular that I want to highlight today, the threat of cyber-enabled foreign interference. Now, foreign interference is a real and significant threat to Australia's national sovereignty. ASIO Director-General Mike Burgess has been warning about the increased scale and sophistication of espionage and foreign interference in our society for some time. He's described them appropriately, I think, as threats to our way of life. Indeed, ASIO's annual report warns that, quote, based on current trends, we anticipate that espionage and foreign interference will supplant terrorism as Australia's principal security concern over the next 5 years. It went on to say that, quote, espionage and foreign interference attempts by multiple countries remain unacceptably high. And these attempts occur on a daily basis and are increasingly sophisticated and regularly enabled by technology. Labor shares the concerns of ASIO on the risk of cyber-enabled foreign interference, and that's why we successfully moved to establish a select committee looking into it, chaired by my colleague Senator McAllister in the other place. And with the threat of cyber-enabled foreign interference growing at such a rapid clip, we cannot be complacent and reactive in our approach to countering it. Effectively countering this threat requires the government and our agencies to be proactive, particularly so when it comes to groups that are frequent targets of foreign interference, but lack the institutional protections afforded to government and other critical infrastructure. Given the continued public warnings from the highest levels of ASIO and the multiple instances of cyber-enabled foreign interference, this shouldn't still need to be said. In the past, we've seen multiple cyber attacks on the university sector for the purposes of espionage and foreign interference. We've seen cyber-enabled campaigns of targeted harassment against journalists, human rights activists and members of diaspora communities in our society. And one recent example that I want to draw the House's attention to is the Pegasus spyware malware campaign recently revealed by The Guardian. Pegasus is a type of malware software developed by Israeli technology firm NSO Group. Once infected, it allows the person operating it to extract messages, photos, emails, record calls and secretly activate microphones of a target's mobile phone. This software is sold by NSO Group to governments around the world, some of whom, it's been revealed in the past, are authoritarian regimes. It's been reported that Pegasus was used to track down close associates of the murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The Guardian has claimed that a leaked dataset obtained by Amnesty International of more than 50,000 phone numbers was a list of Pegasus targets and alleged that amongst the targets were politicians, journalists and activists. Now, unfortunately, Australians looking for information from the government or our intelligence services on how to find out if they have been targeted by this malware have been left wanting. Some enterprising security researchers at Citizen Lab out of the University of Toronto developed a tool to enable individuals to check their devices for signs of compromise. Now, Australians, particularly those most at risk of being targeted by cyber-enabled foreign interference, like members of our diaspora communities, journalists, think tank members, could have benefited from a similar tool being made available by our security agencies for their use. And it raises the question of why we aren't doing more to proactively identify opportunities to help at-risk members of these diaspora communities targeted by authoritarian countries to protect themselves through strategic and scalable interventions of this kind. This should be a real focus for government and our security and intelligence agencies. But unfortunately, it seems that the Morrison government loves to use cyber-enabled foreign interference as a buzzword at media conferences, but hasn't yet shown the commitment to following through on protecting members of diaspora communities in the Australian general public from authoritarian countries. In the shadow of a federal election, this should become an even more urgent priority. ASPI has identified dozens of elections that have been interfered with through cyber-enabled foreign interference in recent years. And when asked at the Foreign Interference Committee who was responsible for responding to foreign interference during an election, the government's answer was half a dozen entities within government, but no single entity with lead responsibility. This is something that must be addressed as a matter of priority. The PJCIS has recently recommended that the government put in place a process during the caretaker period for an apolitical disclosure of cyber-enabled foreign interference. It's also recommended the need to update caretaker provisions to provide classified briefings to the opposition during the caretaker period. If the government is serious about tackling cyber-enabled foreign interference and implementing these recommendations is the least it can do, and more broadly it needs to give priority to proactively tackling this threat.
The member's time has expired. The question before the chair is the motion be agreed to, and I give the call to Member for Curtin.
Thank you. I thank the member for moving this motion. I too recognise the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, for the critical role it plays in protecting Australia and all Australians from threats to their security. ASIO works tirelessly to protect Australians from politically motivated and communal violence through collecting intelligence, analysing and investigating terrorism threats, and providing advice to and working with partners to strengthen public safety and intervene to disrupt terrorist attacks. The need for ASIO and the government's support for ASIO has never been stronger. given Australia's terrorism threat level has remained at probable since it was declared that in 2014. ASIO's Director-General, Mike Burgess, stated to Senate estimates in May this year, and I quote, "Australia's threat environment is complex, challenging and changing. In terms of threat to life, the terrorism threat level remains probable, and unfortunately it is unlikely to be lowered in the foreseeable future. Right now, ASIO is aware of multiple religiously motivated violent extremists who want to kill Australians." He also noted that at the same time, our investigations into ideologically motivated violent extremists, such as racists and nationalists, are approximately 50% of our onshore priority counter-terrorism caseload. The Director-General's words should serve as a disturbing yet important reminder that Australia's national security should never be met with complacency, and that action must be taken to support ASIO and our other national security agencies in their everyday efforts to protect Australia against people and organisations that seek to bring violence, chaos and disruption upon us. That is why the Morrison government is committed to supporting ASIO in its efforts to protect the country and the Australian people. As announced in the budget, the government is giving ASIO unprecedented capability uplift by investing $1.3 billion over the next 10 years. This substantial commitment will allow ASIO to sustain its operations, enhance its capabilities to operate in a more complex threat environment, and respond to challenges posed by rapid technological change. Part of that money, which I particularly want to focus on, is the commitment of $945 million for the current operations building capability and enterprise transformation program. This funding will significantly enhance ASIO's ability to identify and respond to threats posed by more and more sophisticated threat actors, whether motivated by violent extremism or attempts at espionage and foreign interference. There's a long list of measures that this funding will support, but just to name a few, the funding will enable ASIO to keep up with the latest technology that Australia's adversaries are using to undermine our national security. It will allow ASIO to defeat encryption-based methods of communication which are currently being exploited by terrorists and spies in an effort to conceal their plans to commit attacks on Australian soil. The investment will also allow ASIO to extract critical intelligence from large and complex data sets to connect the dots between that information and more reliably identify potential threat indicators. It will accelerate ASIO's operational responses, and it will enable ASIO to promptly deliver detailed advice to government, industry and other stakeholders to ensure security threats are taken care of as soon as they are identified. At the core of the Morrison government, there has always been a robust, unmatched commitment to ensuring the protection of all Australians. Through this unprecedented investment in ASIO over the next decade, the government is ensuring that ASIO will continue to evolve so it can continue to out-imagine and outmanoeuvre sophisticated foreign adversaries, detect and disrupt violent extremists, and ultimately to protect the Australian people. I also note that the government continues to ensure that the exercise of these powers by our security agencies is subject to strong and uncompromising oversight, including through the Inspector-General, the INSLM and the PJSIS. Finally, I would like to take this time to thank the many dedicated men and women who work in ASIO for the important work they do each day to protect their country and fellow Australians. Working for ASIO, much like our other national security agencies, takes a huge amount of sacrifice and commitment. Without their continued dedication, the many freedoms we enjoy on a daily basis and the incredible way of life that we have in this country simply wouldn't exist.
The question is the motion be agreed to, and I'll give the call to member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Australia's threat environment is complex, challenging and changing. The member for Berowra notes these comments from the Director-General of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, Mike Burgess, in ASIO's annual report tabled last week. It is of vital importance that we have an honest conversation with the Australian people about the challenges facing Australia from malicious actors who would seek to undermine our democratic institutions and threaten our way of life. In response to the rapid deterioration of our strategic landscape and the increasingly frequent and complex threats we face, the Morrison government has embarked on a series of landmark investments, initiatives and partnerships to enhance our national security and protect our national interests. One area of extreme concern is espionage and foreign interference, which ASIO states is poised to become Australia's principal security concern over the next 5 years. ASIO has identified sophisticated and wide-ranging espionage and foreign interference attempts occurring on a daily basis. The threat is higher now than during the Cold War. The Morrison government is giving ASIO an unprecedented capability uplift to address this by enhancing operational ability to counter these complex threats and respond to rapid technological change. One particular area enduring sustained, concentrated threats is our critical infrastructure. Our energy, telecommunications, healthcare, banking, food and water all exist in the increasing spectrum of grey zone targets in the current environment. That's why the Morrison government is introducing new legislation to urgently protect Australia's critical infrastructure from cyber infiltration and attack. We're investing $1.25 billion over 10 years to enhance ASIO's ability to connect the dots through a human-led, data-driven, technology-enabled approach to threat detection. We are empowering our national security agencies, including ASIO, the Australian Signals Directorate, Australian Secret Intelligence Service, Australian Federal Police and more, to deter and respond to the complex, challenging and changing threats Australia is facing today. This is not unique to Australia's critical infrastructure. In the Indo-Pacific, we see rapid military modernisation, increased foreign interference, cyber threats, the proliferation of disinformation and overt economic coercion. These wide-ranging strategic challenges require wide-ranging strategic responses, and we are exercising multiple layers to strengthen our national security to keep Australians safe. The Morrison government is further enhancing our ability to shape our environment, deter actions against our interests and, if required, respond with force by enhancing our relationships with trusted, like-minded partners. The establishment of a new trilateral security partnership with the United Kingdom and the United States, AUKUS, and the elevation of the Quad with India, Japan and the United States are testament to this. As a chair of the Australia-United States Parliamentary Friendship Group, I welcome this momentous step towards the interoperability between our great friend and ally at a bilateral level and within these significant multilateral partnerships. As the Prime Minister said in the first in-person meeting of Quad leaders in Washington, DC, we stand here together in the Indo-Pacific region, a region that we wish to be always free from coercion, where our partners stand with us, which is absolutely important for our future going ahead, and where disputes are settled peacefully and in accordance with international law. Australia stands up for our values, especially in the face of adversity. We have shown this through the pandemic. From the beginning, Australia showed leadership, leading the call on the international stage for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 that has wreaked havoc around the world, decimating lives and livelihoods. Australians have stood up each and every day, keeping each other safe and demonstrating our resilience as a nation. Former US Ambassador to Australia, Arthur Culverhouse Jr., recently applauded Australia for standing up for its sovereign right to protect the integrity of its communications, political processes and government deliberations, in the face of what Ambassador Culverhouse calls unabashed economic coercion from the Chinese Communist Party. And I worked closely with Ambassador Culverhouse during his tenure through my role as chair of the United States Parliamentary Friendship Group, and I agree with his assessment of Australia's resilience. Thank you very much.
There being no further speakers, the debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. The Clerk.
Private members' business, notice number 3, motion on Centrelink services.
The member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I move that the motion relating to Centrelink services in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper.
The member for Newcastle.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to move this motion today, and I'm grateful to the member for Canberra who has agreed to second it, because her community, like mine, is facing the brutal reality of this Morrison Liberal government's decision to close or reduce access to Centrelink offices. But the member for Canberra's local Centrelink office is not the only office under threat from being merged or shut down altogether. From Mornington and Newport in Victoria to Tweed Heads in the city of Newcastle in New South Wales, local communities have been left in a state of anxiety and uncertainty, unsure if their local Centrelink office is even going to be there when they need it. Year on year, this Liberal government has set out to starve Centrelink of resources and curb its ability to deliver essential support for Australians. Not content with its history of cuts and under-resourcing, the Morrison government is now turning its attention to shutting down Centrelink's physical presence in our communities, the very offices that people need to go to when they need assistance and support. 2 years ago, the former Minister for Government Services made clear his government was planning to close King Street and Mayfield Centrelink offices in Newcastle. Indeed, we later found out that the government was actually planning to end 5, not just 2, public service tenancies in my electorate, and they intended to consolidate these 5 offices into one single CBD building. The proposed closures of the King Street and Mayfield Centrelink offices was never an isolated decision. It was instead part of a very devious and coordinated plan to drastically shrink Centrelink's frontline footprint. True to form, the Morrison government hasn't been honest with the public about these plans. There has been zero consultation with my community, leaving job seekers, people with disabilities, their carers, pensioners and families completely in the dark now for over 2 years. Every time the minister is asked for more details of these reckless plans, the government hides behind the guise of commercial incompetence. The people relying on Centrelink tell me how much it means to them to be able to talk face-to-face with another human in times of when they're in crisis. My constituents want to be able to attend their Centrelink shopfront in person to access the support they need when they need it. This is not an unreasonable request. How dare this government set about accessing critical frontline services in Newcastle with such little regard for the consequences? And how dare they treat Novocastrians with such contempt, and how dare they think they can get away with this appalling plan? The Morrison Liberal government's relentless push to close Centrelink shopfronts across Australia is just another step in a long line of attempts to undermine Australia's social security safety net. For years, the Liberal government has refused to increase Newstart or even acknowledge that it was shockingly inadequate to begin with. We haven't forgotten the 4 long, anxious and fearful years that this Liberal government pursued hundreds of thousands of innocent Australians with false or inflated social security debts as part of its now infamous robo-debt scheme. And yet this government hasn't learned a thing. They remain fiercely committed to forcing Australians, some in their 50s and 60s who've worked all their lives but found themselves redundant, to now undergo drug tests by urinating in a cup as a condition of receiving support. They've foreshadowed a national rollout of compulsory income management, seeking to punish and humiliate Australians in need of support. It's a cruel and callous plan that will prevent pensioners, those on an aged pension, a disability support pension, even carers, from being able to use their cash to buy cheaper foods from local markets or stores, buy second-hand furniture, give some money to their grandkids, be able to go and have an occasional meal with friends or families at the local club. But over the past decade, the Liberal Party's strategy on social security has been to just make it so impossibly cruel to navigate that people just give up and walk away, destined to be trapped in poverty. Seriously, what kind of government even contemplates ripping the social safety net from its people as they struggle to recover from a global pandemic? The notion of closing Centrelink offices as demand skyrockets is both cruel and foolish. With unemployment rising in the last month and the global pandemic far from over, it is unbelievable that the Morrison government would close the King Street and Mayfield Centrelink office. This government has demonstrated nothing but contempt for the tens of thousands of Australians that will feel the detrimental impact of their plans. Let me be very clear, Prime Minister. Newcastle says no to this terrible plan. We say no to starving Centrelink of the resources it needs to properly support Novocastrians in our times of need. And I am calling on you, Prime Minister, to assure the people of Newcastle that you will ditch this reckless and callous plan to consolidate, reduce or close access to our Centrelink offices once and for all.
Has expired. Is the motion seconded? Member for Canberra? I thank the member for Canberra. The motion is seconded. So the question before the chair is that the motion be agreed to, and I give the call to member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. And I don't really wish to get into a tit-for-tat argument with those opposite about which political party can claim the legacy of social security in our country, and I won't probably get to do that now. We have a division.
A division has been called in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. And I give the call to member for Moncrieff in continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I know that Australians don't really want or need a history lesson from those opposite. They want the planning and they want the action that this government, the Morrison government, has delivered throughout these most uncertain times. The truth is, of course, that Australia's social security system has served us very well. Prior to this crisis, we saw the proportion of working-age Australians reliant on payments down to their lowest levels in more than 30 years at 13.5%. But what I will say as a preamble to this motion is that it was, in fact, under Menzies that the first child endowment payment was delivered in 1941. And it saw the establishment of a national government-provided social security system. Unemployment, sickness benefits and the widows' pensions all followed that by Labor governments. When coronavirus hit, Moncrieff had about 5,900 individuals on Centrelink payments. It very quickly went up to over 15,000 individuals who had enhanced social security through the coronavirus supplement payment at that time, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was a lifesaver for so many in the community. And of course, it was the combination of the JobSeeker coronavirus supplement and JobKeeper 1 and 2 that kept the doors open for over 10,000 small businesses on the Central Gold Coast, which is 1/3 of all small businesses in my electorate, which in turn helped thousands of families to get through those tough early days of the pandemic. Australia indeed has one of the best, if not the best, safety net for our citizens than any other country around the world. And that's been particularly highlighted during this last 19 or so months of the global pandemic, with the provision of 2 million working-age payment recipients, including the JobSeeker payment, the parenting payment and student payment recipients. $20 billion, or $9,400 per recipient, was paid to enhance the social security net of those Australians who needed it. Now, in addition, we've delivered the largest increase to unemployment benefits since 1986. Since 1 April 2021, the Morrison government has permanently increased the rate of working-age payments, including the JobSeeker payment, youth allowance and the parenting payment, by $50 a fortnight, and is in addition to the usual indexation of payments that occurred on both 20 March 2021 and 20 September 2021. This increase comes at a cost of $9.5 billion to the Australian taxpayer, and we must respect that these payments are a result of taxes coming from those who work to support those who don't or cannot. Madam Deputy Speaker, throughout the height of the pandemic, we've provided $32 billion in emergency support payments, and on top of that, this year we've made 4 economic support payments totalling $2,000 to around 5.1 million aged pensioners, disability pensioners, including my dear old dad, I might say, Madam Deputy Speaker, carer payment recipients, family payment recipients and veterans payments recipients over the course of 2021. This came at a cost to the taxpayer of over $12 billion. The government has also put in place a range of supports to ensure all Australians have a safety net to get them through the lockdowns. Now, be that through the disaster payment, the pandemic leave payment or income support payments provided to Australians on a regular and ongoing basis. In addition, there is support through the National Health Emergency Crisis Payment for those who are required to self-isolate or care for someone who is required to self-isolate because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The history books will show that no government in the last 30 years, not Rudd, not Gillard, not Keating, has done more for Australians doing it tough than this government, than the Morrison government. In terms of what members opposite are saying about diminishing shop fronts, there are 319 customer-facing sites delivering services to the Australian community. Services Australia operates 398 commercial properties in every state and territory in the country, and increased uptake of online services via MyGov and Express Plus mobile apps. Over the past 6 years, there's been a 43% decrease in customers visiting service centres. And so, in my mind, if I were a customer of Centrelink, I would like to be able to access Centrelink payments in a number of ways. Some of them are shopfront, some of them are digital, and that is enhancing our modern nation, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The member's time has concluded. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I give the call to member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise in support of the motion moved by the member for Newcastle, and I thank her for moving this important motion today, which highlights the importance of our social security system, something that we as a nation should take more pride in. We do take pride in the fact that we have universal health care and a strong public education system. But it is the social safety net, along with decent wages, that keep Australians out of poverty and should enable all Australians to live with dignity and to have opportunity. It should be what makes us a society, that we support each other when we need it. But this government is ideologically opposed to the social safety net. They have neglected it and focused on cutting it and demonising it and everyone who accesses it. This motion also focuses on Centrelink, vital to delivering these services, and their attacks extend to this too. We are seeing Centrelinks closed around the country, including the Braddon Centrelink in my electorate, the only Centrelink in my electorate, the only Centrelink in central Canberra. The pandemic has shown us just how essential social security really is, and the Centrelink shopfronts that deliver it. Around the nation, we saw scenes something like the Great Depression, long lines of people stretching out the doors of Centrelink shopfronts as workers found their lives turned upside down and their jobs gone when the pandemic hit. We saw the power of social security payments to keep people out of poverty in a time we were in recession, and also to enable people to stay home and keep us safe from the spread of COVID. The social safety net literally saved lives. JobKeeper and the coronavirus supplement ensured that people who lost work didn't sink into poverty, and people who were looking for work were given a lifeline. Research from the Australian National University...
I interrupt the member. A division has been called for in the House. I'm sorry, it's indicate it's changed. It's a quorum. So, my apologies to the chamber. The wrong colour bell was ringing, so I give the call back to the member for Canberra.
No worries. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Research by the ANU confirms this, that the extra $550 per fortnight lifted hundreds of thousands of Australians out of poverty. And the government could have kept this, could have ensured that people were kept out of poverty at least until the end of the pandemic. But they reduced it and then removed it completely, and hundreds of thousands of Australians were pushed back into poverty. And what this shows, apart from this government's penchant for cruelty, is that poverty is a public policy choice. It was a choice of this government to put people first and improve the lives of millions of Australians, and it was a choice of this government to push them straight back down. And it's not just the payments he has taken away. As I said, Centrelinks are closing around the country. The Braddon shopfront in central Canberra is used by thousands in the inner north and inner south of Canberra. It's conveniently located, and the well-trained staff are known for their professionalism, empathy and ability to help. Exactly the opposite of this government's approach to social security recipients. Earlier this year, I found out by a Facebook post that the office space was being advertised, that the government was looking at closing this Centrelink shopfront. And I started a petition that almost 1,500 Canberrans have signed. Despite this huge community support for the service remaining open and zero community consultation about the closure, the Minister wrote to me earlier this month to confirm that the government will axe this crucial shopfront in December, right before Christmas, and they won't be opening a replacement anywhere in central Canberra. So what does the minister say to pensioners, people with disability, job seekers, students, parents, people experiencing homelessness or escaping domestic violence who rely on this shopfront? What do they say to those struggling to survive on the disgracefully low job seeker payment of $43 per day, who now have to spend a significant portion of their weekly income on public transport to get to Gungahlin or Woden to access a Centrelink shopfront? Not everyone can use online services. Not everyone.
The member, a quorum is not present. The chamber will suspend until the chair is resumed.
Can use online services. Not everyone has a computer or a smartphone. Not everyone even has an address. Canberrans have told me how important this Centrelink is to them. Lorenzo is a student at the ANU who lives in the inner north. He became ill last year and had to cease full-time study. He went into Braddon to get help to sort out his payments and ended up being entitled to a $1,000 back pay. His was an issue that couldn't be sorted out over the phone. There were no forms to fill out. The online portal didn't have the answers. People like Lorenzo need a service centre close by. Canberrans are not going to stand by and watch the government close the only Centrelink in my electorate. It is not good enough from this government, who knows nothing other than to demonise and attack our social security system and the important services that deliver it. We will fight to save our Centrelink in the inner Canberra.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Nope. There being no further speakers, the debate is adjourned. Oh. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Patterson.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I'm proud to speak in support of this motion moved by my colleague, the member for Newcastle. Australia's social security system is indeed a proud Labor legacy, and it is one that we will continue to support, protect, strengthen and defend. A lease sign in the window of Kurri Kurri Centrelink caused immediate concern in my community in February of 2019. I made representations to the Minister and the Department for Social Services, and the doors remain open. It seems to have been a leasing issue, but we're watching. The people of Kurri need a Centrelink office as much as all of the other townships that have them across Australia. And as we have seen, particularly in times of health, economic uncertainty, social security payments provide essential economic stability for families. They are a vital safety net. Currently, 2 million Australians are looking for work or looking for more work. Over 300,000 more Australians are relying on unemployment payments of some nature compared to before this terrible pandemic. Centrelink has provided critical support over the course of COVID-19 for these and other people who need help. My office, which is situated right next door to a Centrelink office, so we see it firsthand, day in, day out, has been inundated with people trying to find out what help they can get, what new payments are available and how they go about navigating the system, the dreaded system, to get help, because the system is complex and it's very confusing. The rules are complex and confusing. I have fantastic professional staff who deal with this constantly, and even they talk about just how much more complex and confusing it has been under this government. And sometimes, in the case of the COVID pandemic, the doors to some Centrelink offices have closed and the phone lines have incredible waiting times. And I can only remember with disdain the day that Minister Roberts stood up in the House of Representatives and said, "Just give Centrelink a tingle." Who gives Centrelink a tingle? Seriously, it can take a portion of your life away. As other speakers today have said, face-to-face Centrelink services are absolutely vital for so many members of our communities, and keeping the doors open in Centrelink offices throughout Australia is now more important than ever. Deputy Speaker, today I want to focus on one other aspect of the social security system that is front and centre in the minds of many in my community and members of my electorate of Paterson, and that's the aged pension. The aged pension, although not a grand amount, is a vital payment for senior members of our community, for those who've worked all their lives, paid their taxes, made valuable contributions in many other ways too. The aged pension is there to ensure in retirement it is comfortable and has some dignity. Labor values aged pensioners. We're on your side if you're on the pension. Unlike those opposite, we don't want to see you struggle. We want to ensure aged pensioners are able to access payments that are their right and that they have the right to spend that money the way they see fit. But this government wants to curtail the capacity of aged pensioners to live life as they choose and spend their money as they wish. It wants to put them all on a cashless welfare card and control 80% of their spending. What an offensive idea, that someone has reached that stage in life and can't figure out how they want to spend their own money. Labor will fight this cashless welfare card hammer and tong with all our might, and indeed my colleague, the member for Bruce, will bring a bill to Parliament to try and stamp it out once and for all. Now, whenever this issue is raised, those on the other side say, "Oh, this is just another Labor scare campaign." Well, it is not. Our communities know it's not. The Morrison government has previously introduced legislation to make it possible, and right at this moment the government is inviting community organisations to apply for grants to become cashless debt card support services. It's right. Under the Strong and Resilient Communities program, it's offering grants to support widespread rollouts of the cashless welfare debit card. It is happening, and we will not let it be so.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to support this motion, which covers one of the most vital safety nets we have in this country in our social services. And one of the things that really sets Australia apart from so many countries around the world is the fact that we do not leave the most vulnerable people in our community to languish on their own. It's the fact that as a community and as governments, we understand an obligation to people who are in a time of need or suffering from some affliction that means that they can't work or they can't access support through family or friends, can turn to their government for help. And of course we're in modern times now, and that help can be accessed in many ways, and there's no doubt that online services have made life so much easier for so many people across the community. But we know that it doesn't work for everyone, and it doesn't work all the time. To tell someone to get online and get to a MyGov account and somehow work out how to access their disability support pension or their age pension or their single-parent pension, not the least because of the, let's just say, difficult track record that this government has had with rolling out IT. But it's also because for some people, they don't have enough money to have an iPhone with a data plan that allows them to be on the internet all the time. They live in an area that the NBN botched rollout means that they don't have access to the data that they need. They can't afford a computer, or perhaps they're of an age or a literary standard or a background which means that they just don't know how to use that technology. And for many people, they need the face-to-face services that come and have traditionally come with Centrelink offices and Services Australia. The Centrelink office in Frankston has social workers who are there to help people with complex needs, not just to work out what payment they may be entitled to, but to work out what are the hurdles in their lives that are stopping them from taking the next step forward. That's an essential service that perhaps can be done on the phone, and during COVID has been done on the phone more than ever, but often requires that real relationship and face-to-face contact. In the name of cost-cutting, however, this Morrison government has taken the approach to Centrelink offices and Services Australia, which isn't one where online complements that face-to-face service that so many needs, but is looking to replace it. Just outside my electorate in Mornington, which used to be part of Dunkley but is now part of the electorate of Flinders, is a Medicare and Centrelink office. It's used by people in my electorate, predominantly pensioners from Mount Eliza and some from Frankston South, and used by people in the Mornington area. Some 800 people visited Mornington Services Centre every week before the pandemic. Some 800 people. And yet, at the very start of this pandemic, this Morrison government, in the dead of night, made a decision without any consultation with anyone. It would seem, without consultation with the member for Flinders, who's the Minister for Health, to shut down that office, and it was to go on the 23rd of March of 2020. It took an amazing community campaign. It took locals from Mount Eliza, from Mornington, from the Mornington Support Information Service, the council. I got on board the campaign. It took petitions, it took interviews with the media, it took inquiries to the government to say, what are you doing, for us to even get a reprieve for that centre for 6 months. And it was only in September of this year that finally we've heard that the Mornington Centre will stay open, at least until March of 2021. But given the effort and the blowback from the community, we're confident we can keep that pressure on. Now, I was proud and pleased to be part of that campaign for the people in my electorate in Mount Eliza and Frankston South that used Mornington Centrelink, for the people not in my electorate that needed to use that Centrelink service, and for the people in my electorate that used Frankston Centrelink, which would have been even more overwhelmed. This government is letting down people in their time of need, and it has to stop. The global pandemic isn't over, and the needs of our people for social services aren't over.
Oh, I thought so. There being no further speakers, are you speaking on this motion?
No, on the
one?
next.
Thank you. There being no further speakers, the debate is adjourned, and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. Clerk.
Private members' business, notice number 4, motion relating to cyber attacks.
I call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I move the motion relating to cyber attacks in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper. According to survey data compiled by cybersecurity company Norton LifeLock, some 7.5 million Australians over the past 12 months have experienced cybercrime. More than 1.4 million Australians were victims of identity theft. Every 8 minutes, a case of cybercrime is reported to the Australian Signals Directorate or the Australian Cyber Security Centre. The impact of these incidents on individuals can be catastrophic and life-changing. Almost overnight, a person's life savings can be taken from them with no chance of recovering those funds. Businesses face extortion or being locked out of their intellectual property and their bank accounts. Individuals' digital identities can be stolen and used to apply for bank loans, false identity documents and more. In the past year, according to Norton LifeLock, over $3 billion was lost by Australians as a result of cybercrime, and even the ACCC's more conservative methodology suggests the figure is as much as $1 billion. Each individual had to spend an average of 8.2 hours trying to resolve the issues caused by cybercrime, costing our economy billions more in lost opportunities. The average amount taken from an Australian business impacted by a cybercrime is more than $33,000, while the average cost of recovering from the incident runs at more than $10,000. Often it is far more. It is no wonder that 70% of Australians now see the protection of their personal information online as a major concern in their life. The Morrison government, however, is very alive to these concerns and is taking unprecedented action to protect Australians. We have a great example of that work in my own electorate of Fisher, where the government supports an organisation called ID Care, which is led by cybersecurity expert David Lacey. I'm grateful to the Minister for Home Affairs for recently joining me in visiting ID Care to hear directly from David about the impacts this scourge is having on our community. David informed the Minister that demand for ID Care's services, helping people to mitigate the impact of cybercrimes on their life, has increased fourfold since 2015. ID Care has now supported more than 200,000 Australians since its establishment in 2014. The Morrison government recognises the growing importance of ID Care's vital and market-leading work, which is why we recently announced $6.1 million in funding to continue providing their services to another 54,000 Australians. In total, the government is investing $15 billion in cybersecurity and defence capabilities. This includes $1.67 billion to keep ordinary Australians safe online through our Cyber Security Strategy 2020. We're developing a national plan to combat cybercrime, which will bring together the powers and capabilities of all our law enforcement, intelligence and security agencies to tackle this challenge. We're already deploying the Australian Signals Directorate's world-leading offensive capabilities to disrupt cybercriminals overseas and conducting sophisticated operations like Project Ironside to catch them in the act. The government has also introduced legislation to strengthen the powers available to the AFP and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission and to increase the resilience of our critical infrastructure. However, we all need to do our bit to fight cybercrime, Deputy Speaker. As I've heard directly from David Lacey at ID Care, there are a few straightforward steps that we can all take to be safer online. Make sure you're updating your apps and operating systems regularly with the latest security patches. Watch out for links sent to you by messaging services and by email. Use multi-factor authentication and passphrases where available, and make sure your passwords are complex and hard to guess. No more password. Finally, always make sure you keep a backup of your data offline, and if anyone phones you asking for any personal details, make certain they are who they say they are. If you are in any doubt, do not give out critical information. Please visit cyber.gov.au, the website of the eSafety Commissioner, idcare.org, or call 1300 Cyber 1 to find out more and protect yourself.
Expired. Is the motion seconded? I'll give the call to the member for Mallee.
The motion is seconded and I reserve my right to speak. Thank you.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Gellibrand.
Thank you, Speaker. I thank the member for Fisher for moving this motion, though I have to say that the member may have left out a few things along the way that I do want to bring to the attention of the House. I'll start out by saying that in the ASD and the ACSC we have some outstanding technical capabilities. They do really fantastic work. There are world-class capabilities in these agencies, and we need to ensure that they've got everything they need to do their jobs. Now, the member for Fisher is right to highlight the threat of ransomware, as I have done in this place many times over the last few years. It's been a rapidly and growing threat over that time, particularly in the last 2 years. So significant that the ACSC, in its first annual cyber threat report in 2020, labelled it, quote, the highest cyber threat facing businesses, and reaffirmed this in its most recent threat report. Unfortunately, despite its agencies continually warning about this threat, the Morrison government has been a little bit slow to wake up to it, and even slower to do something about it. I first mentioned ransomware in this place more than 4 years ago, in 2017. In 2019, I warned in this chamber that, quote, this threat is imminent. We've seen it playing out in the United States. If the Morrison government fails to act now, then the consequences of these attacks in Australia will be on its head. Of course, they didn't act. The former Minister for Home Affairs, the member for Dixon, never once mentioned ransomware in this place in his entire time in the role. That's despite the rapidly escalating ransomware attacks on Australian businesses during his years in the role. We saw multiple Victorian hospitals hit with ransomware in October 2019. BlueScope Steel hit with ransomware in May 2020, transport and logistics firm Toll in February 2020, and one of our biggest breweries, Lion, in June 2020, and countless more that didn't make the news headlines. But what did we hear from the Morrison government about what it was doing to stop those attacks at that time? Crickets. Cybersecurity was at the bottom of the Home Affairs Minister's to-do list, and it's been at the bottom of the Morrison government's priority list ever since, with countless opportunities to act passed up. The member for Fisher should listen, because one of the first acts of this Prime Minister when he took the job was to abolish the dedicated role for cybersecurity in the ministry. His 2020 cybersecurity strategy, released in April 2020, mentions ransomware only twice, once in a third-party quote and once in a list of issues the ACSC can advise on. The Department of Home Affairs Industry Advisor report on ransomware in March 2021 released this report in March 2021, but it consisted entirely of advice to business and included no new government policy initiatives. Australia's International Cyber and Critical Tech Engagement Strategy, also released in April, only mentions ransomware once in a list of past attributions of cyber attacks, and again includes no new policy initiatives. Now, to her credit, the current Minister for Home Affairs said that cybersecurity was, quote, a priority for her on coming into the job. Unfortunately, by the time the scourge of ransomware has escalated to a crisis point is when the government has started paying attention. We've seen high-profile ransomware attacks on the Nine network, JBS, our biggest meat supplier, and internationally on the Colonial Pipeline. Now, Labor, having recognised this threat some time ago, has tried to be constructive in this area. We haven't just stood on the sidelines and criticised, we've proposed ideas. In February this year, we released a discussion paper calling for a national ransomware strategy designed to increase the costs and reduce the returns of ransomware attacks on Australia, and outlined a series of ideas for how we could go about it. Among others, we recommended a mandatory notification scheme for ransomware payments, an idea we crystallised in a private member's bill in June. We recommended renewed efforts to close the cyber enforcement gap through increased law enforcement cooperation, a new campaign of offensive cyber operations against ransomware crews that target Australians, and new anti-money laundering interventions against cryptocurrency exchanges to cut off their payment systems. Now, I'm pleased to see that the government has now adopted all of these proposals, if somewhat belatedly. In July 2021, the government launched a multi-agency ransomware task force targeting ransomware led by the AFP called Operation AUKUS, TIC. In October, 9 months after we called for a national ransomware strategy, the minister released a ransomware action plan. Totally different. TIC. Included in the plan were new anti-money laundering laws, TIC, and powers targeting cryptocurrency payments, TIC. New commitments joining international and cyber offensive operations against ransomware crews too, TIC. The new plan even included a mandatory notification scheme, not just for payments but for all ransomware attacks. This, I admit, came as a bit of a surprise, as when the minister was asked why the government wouldn't simply support Labor's widely welcomed private member's bill to require notification of ransomware payments, she said, quote, "What I don't want to do is end up putting the cart before the horse and moving directly to this is a mandatory reporting of ransomware." She didn't want to act because the government hadn't, quote, "gone through the process of raising awareness of cybersecurity and raising awareness of ransomware with Australian organisations." If a ransomware payment notification scheme was too much too soon for business, according to the minister, it's difficult to see how a notification scheme for all ransomware attacks isn't too much today. Regardless, distinction is likely to be mute, as there's not enough sitting days left before the election to pass this bill. The government
time has expired. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Curtin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I thank the member for this motion. Cyber attacks are a deliberate act of manipulating or destroying computers, networks or information, and I strongly support the government's significant investment in its prevention. Cyber is a new battlefield which we must be prepared to protect, as it poses threats to individuals and businesses alike. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre received over 60,000 cybercrime reports last financial year, and it is reported that 7.5 million Australians experienced cybercrime. This has resulted in over $3 billion lost by Australians as a result of cybercrime, and over $61 billion lost trying to resolve issues created by cybercrime. The problem of cyber attacks has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, as people are spending more time online than ever, and while continuing to increase their usage and using the internet and various other online devices, connecting into the internet, 48% of Australian consumers feel more vulnerable to cyber attacks now than prior to the pandemic. So despite feeling vulnerable, our usage continues to increase. And although many Australians are taking steps to protect their cyber activities, including 70% of Australians taking more precautions online, individual actions alone do not quell the rising threat of coercive activity that could undermine Australia's digital sovereignty. Overcoming this risk is a team effort that has government, organisations, business and individuals working together for the common goal of protecting Australia's cyberspace. And I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the important work of the Australian Cyber Security Centre. They are a critical part of the team providing information to businesses and individuals on how to protect themselves online and providing technical support to those affected by cybercrime. This government is committed to developing the next national plan to combat cybercrime, a plan that will build on the Cybersecurity Strategy 2020. We have a duty to Australians to ensure that we are doing everything we can to prevent and manage cyber attacks, and we are meeting this obligation by investing $15 billion in cyber education, offensive capabilities and task forces to tackle cybercrime. I just want to spend a moment speaking on the biggest threat to Australia's online security, and that is ransomware, a malicious type of software that cybercriminals use to deny individuals and organisations access to their information and demand payment to have this access returned. Perhaps the most concerning attacks using ransomware in recent times are those targeted at our banks. Banks have been disproportionately affected by cyber attacks, with banks in the US experiencing a staggering 1,300% year-on-year increase in ransomware attacks this year. This is also occurring here on our own soil, with the Reserve Bank of Australia reporting that a significant cyber attack is inevitable given year-on-year growth. The Australian Government is acting appropriately and preemptively to mitigate this threat to financial institutions, as we are also protecting the privacy and information of all Australians. Strong defensive cybersecurity is the best chance we have against ransomware, which is why the ACSC have a variety of resources available regarding ransomware and protecting against attacks, alongside a free alert service for all Australians and Australian businesses. I would encourage all Australians to visit cyber.gov.au and have a read of the Ransomware Attacks Emergency Response Guide and Ransomware Attacks Prevention and Protection Guide. There are also personal security guides with advice on how to protect yourself from common cyber threats. To keep these practical and simple, there are 5 simple things you can do to protect yourself online. Update your apps and computer systems. You can do this by simply turning on automatic updates. Use multi-factor authentication. Use passphrases, not passwords, making sure that they are complex. Back up your data in a place separate to your network. Beware of emails and messages from unknown organisations or people. In fact, a message just came through on our parliamentary network this morning reminding us not to open up unknown addresses. So I reiterate that dealing with cybercrime is a team effort, and we all need to pull our weight to secure Australia's digital environment. And again, I thank the government and the ACSC for their hard work that they do, and the Australian businesses and individuals taking the time to educate themselves. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Oxley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on this important motion today before the House and thank the member for Fisher for raising this in the Parliament and recognise all of the contributions so far. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an issue that I think unites us all, keeping Australians safe. But ransomware attacks are now the biggest threat facing the Australian government and businesses and our broader community. This is according to the Australian Cyber Security Centre, who warn that these attacks, where criminal groups deny access to an organisation's IT systems and data until a ransom is paid, are becoming more sophisticated and far more damaging than ever before. Ransomware is the most common breach of an organisation's data security. Increasingly savvy cyber criminals now target organisations extracting hundreds of thousands of dollars from each successful attack and helping to drive small and medium-sized enterprises out of business. Australia is not alone in this crisis. The former director of the US Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency recently told the US House Committee on Homeland Security that ransomware was the nation's top cyber threat. Globally, security firm MCSoft estimates that the global cost of ransomware attacks in 2019 was at the very least $42.4 billion and is likely to be closer to $169.7 billion. Here in Australia, these attacks are estimated, as we know, to have cost our economy at least in $1.1 billion of US dollars. It's difficult to capture the full scope and scale of these attacks, both globally and here in Australia. But these numbers show us that action is necessary to combat this threat. We need a national ransomware strategy. This issue isn't going away anytime soon, and it cannot be up to the private sector and Australian organisations to fight this threat alone. While organisations have primary responsibility for their own cybersecurity, the government does have tools at its disposal that could help reduce the risk for Australian organisations and lower the overall volume of attacks here in Australia. These include regulation making, law enforcement, diplomacy, international agreement making, offensive cyber operations and the imposition of sanctions. These interventions can make Australia less attractive overall to cyber criminals by increasing risks for attackers and attaching significant costs to targeting Australian businesses and organisations. With a strong basis of deterrence, the federal government can shore up our national cyber security by assisting stakeholders to increase their resilience against such attacks. These interventions are important because we know that ransomware attacks do not exist in a vacuum. The actions of one organisation can shape the nature of the threat faced by others. When an organisation decides that it's in its own best interest to pay a ransom, it increases the resources available to ransomware crews to mount further, more sophisticated attacks against other targets. When a series of organisations from particular countries or particular industry sectors make ransomware payments, it can create a reputation that these countries or industries are valuable targets, increasing the number of future attacks. Whilst network security might be an organisational challenge, ransomware is a threat that requires collective action in response. And this is where our federal government must step in and deploy a policy and regulatory framework to mitigate the risk of ransomware. We need a comprehensive national ransomware strategy with the aim of reducing the attractiveness of Australian targets to cyber criminals. While I'm here, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to highlight a local business in my electorate of Oxley that is making strides in this field. CryptoLock. CryptoLock's patent technology ensures that businesses and their customers can interact securely. While most encryption solutions only use one algorithm and two keys, CryptoLock's patent technology combines 3 different encryption algorithms into one unique multi-layer process and requires 3 different key pairs located in 3 separate locations to decrypt protected data. Held by Forbes as one of the 20 best cybersecurity startups to watch in 2020, CryptoLock's technologies can be deployed across a wide range of applications, including file storage, document management and counterfeit prevention and detection solutions to protect businesses and organisations against attacks. Cybersecurity is only going to become more and more important as our world becomes increasingly digital. Businesses like CryptoLock are leading the way when it comes to risk mitigation and attack prevention. There is no silver bullet against these attacks. Cyber criminals will continue to evolve their strategies. We need to ensure that we are evolving with them and that our government is agile enough to face the cybersecurity challenges of today. And
the question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Groom.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. Cyber attacks are no longer only the concern of very large global corporations. Increasingly, we're seeing small regional businesses fall victim to malware and ransomware attacks. Last year, the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre received over 60,000 cybercrime reports, one every 8 minutes, an extraordinary number. And at this point, I might pause.
Order. It's a quorum.
I'm sorry, Deputy Chair. I've been informed by the Group's office that even though it's a quorum, we're still required to go downstairs. So.
Go.
Yeah, we'll just announce that we're suspending.
Federation Chamber is suspended and will resume when the chair is resumed. call the member for Groom.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I fear I may have lost momentum, but I'll pick it back up. It's a concerning trend, the increase in cybercrime we're seeing. It can have a devastating impact on mum and dad operations. Now, I know of one panel beating workshop in my electorate of Groom, which had its files seized and was forced to buy Bitcoin to get its digital property back off of hackers. It's a cost they certainly could have gone without, plus the downtime required to get its systems back online was an added pain. I think this answers in a way that might reflect a title of a Smiths song, How Small is Small? We're talking very small businesses. These are single operators with a computer without much training and certainly having their first interaction with Bitcoin in many of these cases. But this changing face of cybercrime victims is a very important reality for Australia to address. It's an issue that no longer belongs on the extremes of either big business or vulnerable grandparents clicking on things that they shouldn't. Small businesses are no longer a secondary concern of cybercriminals, but in many cases are being specifically targeted, the size of the payday being of less importance than the ease with which it can be won. I know many small business owners feel this couldn't happen to them, or that the cost of implementing cybersecurity measures just isn't worth it. But I think I'm here, and the previous speakers are all here to say that it does happen. The average cost of recovering from cybersecurity incidents starts at around $10,000. Realistically, usually it's far more. And unfortunately, attacks only have to be successful just at one time to cause tremendous damage. Money, valuable client information, years of data are able to be swiped in just a matter of minutes. And if anything, the increasing move towards working from home during the pandemic has multiplied the risk we face, with employees working from often unsecure networks, particularly in small businesses, instead of the centralised protected locations they previously enjoyed. But while this is a new frontier for regional businesses, I'm proud we've already have a number of operators leading the way in cybersecurity in the Toowoomba region. It's a fantastic opportunity to take Minister Karen Andrews out to see some of them during my visit to my electorate in May of this year. I know she was very impressed with the calibre of innovation that was on display. And Toowoomba prides itself in taking a punt on new technology, and this is certainly true in the field of cybersecurity. One such project was FKG's Pulse Data Centre, which is the first large-scale data centre outside of a major capital city in Australia. It's a magnificent facility that speaks to the future of Toowoomba's regional economy and its ambitions of becoming that bit more of a big city. It supports corporate customers, small to medium businesses, governments and international technology giants. Toowoomba is the perfect location for a centre like this, firstly because it's able to cater intimately, personally, with small businesses who have these needs, but also it has the added physical security of being located outside of a capital city. With a low threat level and any natural disaster that impacts Brisbane is unlikely to affect us on top of the hill, or on the other side of the hill in this case. The centre also offers strong data security because Pulse Data Centre is 100% Australian owned. It ensures all data stored in the centre is covered under Australian laws, and this is an important issue in an internationally fluid environment. Another important player in this space was Heritage Bank in the Toowoomba region. We were able to show the Minister the cyber security measures they use to keep their customers' financials safe. It's clearly an issue they take very seriously. Commend them for their efforts. It was great to see the leading-edge practices they use to stay ahead of cyber criminals and assist law enforcement agencies. And this cooperation with relevant authorities was repeatedly presented as a key driver of the bank's success in this area. And that's a very important message for small businesses too, that it's far better to be proactive rather than reactive when it comes to cyber security. And there is much information available at cyber.gov.au that will be of use no matter the size of your business. This includes simple tips such as checking your systems to ensure you're operating on updated apps and computer software, upgrading to multi-factor authentication, and keeping a backup of your data off the network. Now, this enables a business IT provider to restore files that may be encrypted or destroyed in a ransomware attack without having to pay hackers for the advantage. The government will continue to play its part, investing $15 billion in cyber and defence capabilities and strengthening protections for our critical infrastructure with new legislation for digital centres and data.
There being no further speakers. The question is the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Higgins.
Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank the member Fisher for moving this motion and providing great opportunity for members to speak on such an important matter to Australia, cyber security. It's no surprise that most of Australia's economy is running off the internet, and most businesses rely on online transactions and communications. Although this is the future, it also makes us vulnerable to cyber attacks. Last financial year alone, Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Cyber Security Centre received over 60,000 cybercrime reports. That's one every 8 minutes. And that's only those that were reported. In the last year, scams are estimated to have cost Australian businesses more than $143 million, at an average of $33,000 taken each time. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no doubt that Australia risks many more cyber attacks in the future. Cyber attacks are low cost, hard to attribute, and can be done at any time, anywhere. Many of us have talked about sovereignty in territorial terms here in this place, but this is changing. Australians need to start the conversation about what it means for Australia to retain and protect its digital sovereignty. We need to protect our critical infrastructure to make sure that digital centres and our data are protected. And that's why, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Morrison government is investing $1.35 billion through the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Cyber Security Centre to keep Australians safer online. This is part of $15 billion the government is investing in cyber and defence capabilities. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've said, cyber attacks are low cost and can happen any time. Anyone in Australia can become a target, whether it's our institutions, businesses or private citizens. In September this year, Stonnington City Council, in my electorate of Higgins, was hit by a cyber attack. The council drew on assistance from the Australian Cyber Security Centre following the attack and was able to continue operating essential services while it dealt with the outage. But this affects the services that governments deliver. It affects the services that businesses deliver. It undermines our privacy. This attack emphasises the warnings from ASIO that councils across Australia can be subjected to cyber attacks. So too are genetic digital data. It's stored in servers across Australia. We need to do more to protect our sovereign data, whether it's government, business or collated medical research data. Protecting it protects Australia's interest. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government is committed to tackling cybercrime, including through developing the next national plan to combat cybercrime, which will bring together the powers, capabilities, experience and intelligence of all jurisdictions to build a strong operational response to cybercrime harming Australians and Australia. Investing $1.6 billion through the Cyber Security Strategy, introducing legislation to bolster the powers of the AFP.
It's a quorum again.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Federation Chamber is suspended and will resume the
consumption of the chair.
Member for Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government is committed to introducing legislation to bolster the powers of the AFP and Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission to identify individuals and their networks engaging in a serious criminal activity on the dark web. We also plan to introduce legislation to uplift the security and resilience of Australia's critical infrastructure and provide $6.1 million for support services through IDCARE to protect Australians online if they've been a victim of cybercrime. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not only what governments can do, however. Cybersecurity requires a shared responsibility. It is vital that Australian businesses and organisations are alert to this threat and take the necessary steps to ensure ours and their digital data is safe. Ensure they are implementing good cyber practices, such as checking systems, making sure that their apps are updated and computer systems regularly are at the latest version, and installing any available security patches. We want them to be mindful of links sent to emails and other messaging systems, And we want multi-factor authentication to make sure there's an extra step between your valuable data, like your bank account, and getting a cyber attack hack. We want to use passphrases, not passwords, and we want you to keep a backup of your data off your network. Madam Deputy Speaker, I encourage all Australians to go to cyber.gov.au to find easy-to-follow guidelines on how to increase your cyber security online. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Hunter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In my more than 25 years in this place representing the good people of the Hunter electorate, there have been issues which have stayed with me as a challenge for all of that period. Two really stand out. The first is intergenerational unemployment, an area in which we've made some inroads, but an area in which I have a very strong view we won't succeed in overcoming until we have an education system that maximises the intervention on children at the earlier stage, preferably at the level of preschool, if not early childcare. It remains my view that intervention at the earliest possible age is critical in the intervention on children who have never known either their parents or their grandparents to have worked, have never woken up to an alarm clock or seen others do so, and have certainly never worked to a routine and a schedule. These are people who are effectively born to be unemployed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the intervention of those wonderful people who work in early childcare, preschool, indeed kindergarten, primary school more generally, will be very, very critical in achieving more success on that front. The second is the shortage of GPs in many of the towns I represent or have represented. Not quite as big a challenge to me these days because with the 2015 redistribution, my electorate substantially shrank from 20,000 square kilometres to 10,000 square kilometres, excising from my electorate many of the more rural townships which found this such a difficult challenge. Alas though, Madam Deputy Speaker, I still have challenges in townships, and I was very pleased that earlier this year the Minister agreed to provide DPA status, that's distribution priority area status, to Muswellbrook LGA in my electorate, which is going to make an enormous difference for people in Muswellbrook and Denman and indeed Marywar in the township of the member for New England. But what has been consistent, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the inadequacy of the system for all that time. We don't have a GP shortage in New South Wales. We have a malapportionment of GPs, and you're very fortunate because I'm sure you have plenty of GPs in your electorate of Parramatta, Madam Deputy Speaker. But alas, in more regional and rural areas, we struggle. Even in a township like Muswellbrook, Morisset, which is on the beautiful, very close to the beautiful western side of Lake Macquarie, near the major train station, taking people to Sydney, and not just near, but on the major train station, and 2 minutes drive from the M1.
Hunter will address his remarks to the motion being debated.
Yes, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was looking for some attitude, of course, because this is an unanticipated expectation. So I'm just going to close by saying that I appreciate the work Minister Hunt has the attention Minister Hunt has provided to this issue for me in recent days, but I still have a number of issues, including in my hometown of Cessnock. I've seen many models used to address this malapportionment, Madam Deputy Speaker. None of them have been perfect. The current system is not perfect, and I hope I can work with the Minister to address some of the existing problems, particularly in Western Lake Macquarie and, of course, in my hometown of Cessnock.
There being no further speakers, the debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. The Federation Chamber is suspended and the chair will be resumed at 4 p.m.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think your intervention might have come